classroom. And I'm Professor Hicks, your classroom professor. And welcome to another session. Today, excuse me, as promised, we're going to get to the educational achievements and realities of the Moors in Iberian or in Spain. Before we move on, I'd like to say welcome and thank you and for attending. Please subscribe. I need all the subscriptions I can, and please make sure you like and share. And if you have any comments, please comments I'll take. So here we are. As I mentioned on several occasions, I was under the I was little how would you call it, under the weather. So I'm feeling much better. So I could think there's a bit lingering, as I mentioned, when you get old, it takes a little longer for these things to get out. But I'm working towards that goal and I'm feeling a lot better. Ready to go. So before we move forward, whenever I get to these sessions as such, when they're going to be a little longer, I have to do ancestor worship. So let me ask the ancestors for permission to speak. Thank you. And as always, we are going to quote our esteemed Dr. John Henry Clarke and what he feels about history. And he says that history is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. He goes on to say that history is also a compass where people find themselves on the map of human geography. And there we find out who we are and what we must be. Ashe to Dr. John Henry Clarke. Great man. We miss him. Okay, so let's get started. And I'm going to be reducing my window at certain times to give you a better pick, but I'm going to read everything so you can get it. So today, here's the question. Here's the question that's going to guide us. How can we describe the educational and intellectual achievements of Moorish Spain? How can we describe the educational and intellectual achievements of the Moors in Spain? Yes, very, very important. If you're thinking about back in high school and you studied the scientific revolution, I taught it, I know it's a high school subject. And if you ever think about the Renaissance, another high school subject, both of these events in time were, I would say influenced, but that's too light a word, but were progenitors. The Moors were progenitors of that information. All right. So there would not have been a scientific revolution without the Moors. There would not have been a Renaissance without the Moors, because Europe at this time did not have this information. Moreover, Europe was emerging from a dark age. And that brings us to one of the first questions. And that is, how in light of being in a dark age did this science flower into such the magnitude that it did in Europe after 14th century? How did this occur? How did the scientific thinkers like Copernicus and Galileo, how is it that at the same time they all began to flourish? And how do we understand the Moors' impact on both of those different time periods? So we're going to find that out today. Today, you have to bear with me because there's going to be some reading I've done with you, and also this slideshow that I promised you that I'm so excited about. And we're going to get started there first, but there's a few things we must get out the way. First of all, let's understand, as Ibn Gharib has said, great Moorish historian, he referred to the Moors as good managers, seekers of knowledge, and lovers of wisdom, philosophy, justice, and fair play. Remember, this is a historian that lived in that period. He knew this about the Moors because it was demonstrated time and time again through examples of their tolerance, as we talked about in one class, the tolerance of the Moors, how the Moors allowed the Jews and the Christians to practice their religion and to keep their values, their religious values, never interfering with whatever they wanted to do with their religions. We talked about Mozarabs, those people who were Christian, who continued to practice the Christian faith, but who took on the customs, the dress, and the language of the Moors. Why would someone do that? We talked about the Iberian Peninsula as being a very, very poor and depressed, oppressed place to be in this time, 711 B. Let me be very clear with that. Not 711 BC, but 711 CE, the Common Era. And then we want to talk about how was this Moorish information, this scientific information, this philosophy, and this academia, how was it transferred? How did it get to you? How did the Europeans get this information? These are all the questions we're going to try to answer over the next few days as it relates to the Moors. For the Moors, the pursuit of knowledge and its attainment represents the highest achievement of these people. Knowledge, know thyself, was the most important goal for these people. In the world of the Moors, knowledge was almost like spirituality. To attain knowledge was not just to attain it for while you were here on earth, but knowledge was attained for the hereafter. Yes. Remember, the Moors are similar to the Egyptians. They are actually just another sect of the Egyptians. And Egypt, there was a place everywhere you went. Any philosophical text you engaged in said, know thyself. The first tenets of psychology came out of Egypt. The ability to understand within and without. So above, so below. We must understand that this cultural continuity traveled from one end of Africa to the other. And that the Moors, who were not just Moors under Islam, but before Islam, there were people called Moors. And that this knowledge that they took with them out of Egypt, buried it in the sands of Timbuktu, kept it in the nations of Songhai, Mali, and took this information from Egypt and refined it, and then brought it into the Iberian Peninsula. It is also important to understand that, as I said before, intellectual achievement was like godly achievements. There was no difference between science and spirituality as we find it here today in our country. Before we move forward, we must understand how this information coming from Egypt by way of the Greeks, the Persians, the Arabs, the British, all the ones I just mentioned were those who invaded Egypt, occupied it. Why? Why was Egypt such a treasure? We'll answer those questions as we move forward. Egypt, which had been invaded and occupied by Islamic Arabs, the Persians, as I mentioned, the British. In this possession of Egypt, there is something that they all wanted. They wanted something called the Egyptian mystery system. And within this Egyptian mystery system, all the knowledge of the world was contained. This knowledge, when recognized by the Greeks, was stolen, plagiarized, copied, and then renamed. I must be very sensitive by saying not all Greeks, because Greeks were one of the few European people who gave credit to Africans for this vast knowledge. Yes, Herodotus, the greatest of the historians, plainly said that Egypt was the land of knowledge. So much of this Egyptian knowledge was translated from Greek, then from Greek to Arabic, then from Arabic to Latin. This is one of the ways in which this information was transformed. Before we go on, we must understand that this knowledge that we're going to talk about, from the Greeks to the Arabs to the Latins, was ancient mystery system knowledge. The Moors, when going back into Africa after leaving Spain, once they conquered it, they went back into Africa, back and forth, to bring the knowledge over to Europe. And as they did this, there's a certain types of things that had to be done. The knowledge had to be translated. It had to be translated from Greek to Arabic, and then to Latin. We're going to discuss how that happened. But before we go there, let's quickly talk about what we must remember. The information that the Moors attained from the Greeks while going back and forth from Iberian Peninsula to Africa, bringing the information back and forth, this was only the same information that the Greeks had plagiarized from Africa. So I don't want it to be, or us to be confused as to when you hear me speak of the Arabs, or I should say the Moors, reintroducing this information from the Greeks, the Arabs, the Latins, that all this information was theirs already. It was the Egyptian information that had been stolen, as I mentioned several times now, plagiarized by the Greeks. The Moors just went back into Africa, got the same information and refined it, reprocessed it, and then presented it to Europe. Okay. Let's go to our slides. As you can see, the Moors' intellectual reality and his impact on Europe is our topic, and the causes and effects of the scientific revolution. Persecution of the Greek philosophers. Pythagoras, because his name is Pythagora, but of course it's been corrupted to Pythagoras. Socrates and Aristotle were all persecuted by their respective Greek city-states. Pythagoras was violently persecuted and may have been killed for exposing Egyptian philosophical teachings from the Egyptian mystery system. This is important information to understand because Western civilization philosophers and historians continually to reinforce and to proclaim that Western civilization is based on Greco-Roman philosophy. Greco-Roman philosophy. They go even further to state that democracy was something that was first a Greek invention. This is questionable. This is questionable. Not to say that some Greeks during this period did not practice or try to a form of democracy, but remember, democracy means demokrasi. Demokrasi, people rule. And at no time in Greece history, did people rule. Greek society was one of stratification. What do I mean by that? You had an upper class and a lower class, and then slaves and serfs. At no time and at no period in Greece or in the islands of Greece, because remember Greece is made up of certain islands, was their democracy. Moreover, as you can see, Pythagoras and Socrates and Aristotle were all persecuted by these Greek city-states. And they were persecuted for teaching the Egyptian mystery systems. You ask yourself why? Well, we'll get to that question and answer it very soon. Socrates' state-sanctioned murder. For those who've done some work on Socrates, you should know that Socrates was famously persecuted or prosecuted and condemned to death by the city of Athens in 339 before the Common Era, accused of corrupting the youth by teachings of the Egyptian mysteries philosophy. Yes, Socrates was held in jail for a number of days before he was finally killed. He committed suicide while incarcerated. But why was he incarcerated? Why was he persecuted? He was persecuted for teaching the Egyptian mystery philosophy, which I might just interject real quickly, spoke of nothing but love. Let's continue. Aristotle, the teacher of Alexander the Great. After Alexander's the Great death, Aristotle was targeted and persecuted for similar activities of Pythagoras and Socrates as well. To avoid persecution, Aristotle left Athens, fled to Chalcis, never to return to Athens. Yes, Aristotle, who, if you've seen movies, was presented as the person who was the ultimate philosopher and guider of Greek democracy, the intellectual who taught the great Alexander his lessons on philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, all of these things. These things he learned from the Africans. Political and religious persecution. All three of these philosophers endured persecution linked to their political and religious beliefs. I wonder how they would fare now in our country with what is going on with political and religious beliefs. If this is true that they were persecuted for their beliefs, how are these thinkers an example of Greek democracy and Western civilization? Yes. How could you have a Greek democracy when the people that are espousing this democracy, this civilization, were persecuted? That would imply that what they were talking about in regard to democracy and enlightenment was not accepted by the political hierarchy of Greece. Before the arrival of the Moors in Europe, scientific activity, what these philosophers taught, was primarily shaped by classical Greek and Roman traditions. Historical tensions existed between the Greek city-states, marked by frequent rivalries, competition, and fierce wars for dominance. Most notably between Athens and Sparta for a hegemony over Greece. This challenges the long-held belief, as I mentioned already, that democracy, civilization, and the birth of the Republic could have emerged from Greco-Roman erudition. The most famous example of this constant ongoing tensions are the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 430, before the current era. So how could science, philosophy, and the study of medicine flower under such conditions? Ask yourself, if you are internally engaged in war as a nation, how can it that you can flower, begin to grow, in the study of philosophy, medicine, cosmology, um, mathematics, algebra. How could a nation who is constantly at war with itself and others have the time for thinking? These questions we ask ourselves as Afrocentric people. We are challenging the thought and the proclamation that Western civilization was based on Greco-Roman erudition. Medieval scientific revolutionary thinkers. All right, so here we go. Now we're going to stop right here for a moment. We're going to take a pause. All right? Because there's a few things that need to be said here. We need to understand, first of all, that the Moors coming into the Iberian Peninsula with this great knowledge, then to take this knowledge and have it translated, were doing nothing more than taking the Egyptian knowledge that they knew already and reintroducing it to the world, particularly Europe. They were highly aware of this information. They brought it with them. During Europe's ascension from the Dark Ages, there were no scientific thinkers. You will see that all of the thinkers of the scientific revolution all emerged at the same time, particularly 14th to the 16th century. So ask yourself, how could a group of thinkers all born during the same time, but also all flowering with this information at the same time? Copernicus, Kepler, Newton, Bra, all of these guys received their information at the same time. Why did any of this not happen in the 12th century? We'll go on. Let's stop there for a moment. So here we go. The deep and important question is much of what we call Greek erudition, learning and scholarship, philosophy and science, had foundations in older African traditions, especially Egyptian knowledge. Let me break it down. Egypt, Kemet, as a school of the Greeks, meaning that the Greeks entered Egypt. They were the first ones. They entered through Alexander the Great in 332 BC, or before the Common Era. And with Alexander came people who were very highly intelligent. These scholars who came into Kemet began to copy the information of the ancient Kemetians or Egyptians. Many of the Greek philosophers studied in Egypt. Plato is said to have studied for years in Heliopolis. This is in Egypt. Pythagoras is linked to Egyptian mathematical and mystical traditions. Thales and Democritus are all reported to have traveled to Egypt, where they had to stay and train to be initiated into the Egyptian mystery system. The Greeks themselves, as I mentioned, Herodotus, acknowledged Egypt's intellectual primacy. Herodotus, often called the father of history, wrote that Egypt was the source of many Greek religious and scientific practices. African contributions to Greek erudition. Mathematics and geometry. Surveying of the Nile gave rise to geometry. This geometry was passed on to the Greeks. The Greeks credited Egyptians with the foundational math, or the word geometry literally means measurements. Medicine, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which you can find down in Fifth Avenue, in one of the great medical centers in the United States, and the Eborus Papyrus, Egyptian medical text, contain advanced medical knowledge centuries before Hippocrates. Or should I say Hippocrates? And for those who don't know, Hippocrates is called the father of medicine. But this information existed before there was a H, before there was a I or a P. Astronomy and calendars. Egyptians created the 365-day calendar, studied the stars for agricultural purposes and religion, and influenced the Greek astronomy. Yes. Something else that was plagiarized from the Egyptian. Philosophy and the mystery schools, excuse me. The Egyptian temples in Thebes, Memphis, served as centers of higher learning, where Greeks encounter metaphysical, ethical, and cosmological teachings. Yes, the Egyptians gave this knowledge freely to the Greeks, particularly those Greeks that showed that they had the ability to accept this knowledge. Library of Alexandria, a major center in Europe and Egypt, where Greeks and Egyptians blended together to learn knowledge. Yes, there was a time when we all got along. Cultural borrowing. Greeks adopted Egyptian deities. Example, Isis and Serapis. And the philosophical ideas about the soul, that the soul transcends at night and returns before the morning. They also talked about things like immortality and the cosmos. These are the subjects and topics that got these thinkers in trouble, because their theocratic governments did not accept this information. Greeks often recast Egyptian knowledge into their own philosophical frameworks. Pythagoras applied Egyptian math and mysticism into number theory. Plato absorbed ideas of the cosmic order, Ma'at as we call it today, into his philosophy of forms and justice. Yes, Plato particularly was an example of European civilization adopting Greek philosophy. Many of our justice documents, our constitutions, have many of the tenets of what Plato talked about. Aristotle systematized much of what early civilizations had developed, framing it as Greek science. Over time, credit shifted towards Greece, even though the roots were Afro-Egyptian. So Greek erudition, in conclusion, was deeply indebted to African, especially African, Egyptian erudition. What the Greeks did was systematize and write down this older wisdom in ways that later Europe adopted. In other words, Africa was the teacher, Greece was the student and the adapter, and Europe the later hire through Greece. Thank you. So let's talk about these thinkers. What did these thinkers, who are going to start our scientific revolution, what did these thinkers bring to the table? Like many of the Greek Roman thinkers described earlier, they were persecuted for their political, religious, and philosophical beliefs. All these thinkers were influenced by Moorish texts. They contributed to the field of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and agriculture. What caused this sudden blossom of intellectual insight and learning in these thinkers who were just emerging from the dark ages of the 12th to the 14th century? The answer is Moorish erudition. Okay. So we're going to take a quick break and we're going to come back to this and complete our slides. Let's just go through it one more time so we can understand where we're going. More's intellectual reality and its impact on Europe. The cause and effect of the scientific revolution, which is blacked out for you. We talked about the persecution of the Greek philosophers, Pythagoras and Socrates, how they were persecuted. Persecuted by their own governments for teaching people about medicine and philosophy and cosmology, about agriculture and measurements and mathematics. Yes, their particular governmental structures did not want to hear this information. Socrates was prosecuted, condemned to death in Athens for teaching this mystery system. Aristotle left Athens, we spoke about, because of teaching this mystery philosophical system. And all three endured persecution. And that brings us before the Moors. What did it look like? During Iberians' time, without the Moors' presence, people lived as kings and queens did in their barns. Yes. Kings and queens in Europe lived in windowless barns. They could not read or write. They did not study science. Hygiene and medicine were not available. Most kings and queens lived in their same clothes for years. Practiced no hygiene. Forbidden in their countries. So how did this flowering come about? Well, folks, in a few words, through the transformation and the translation of information. That rhymes, I like that. So we're going to go again, take a moment, break. I'll be back in a moment. And I say this point, Hashem.